This study is looking at educational leadership and the impact of opioids on students in schools in Ohio. We're presenting today on a part of a much larger study. We realize that educational leaders face a number of dilemmas on a regular basis. Sometimes these deal with competing or conflicting values in their practice. And so looking at how principals and superintendent have to be morally reasonable and morally responsible. They have to enact ethical sensitivity in their responses. And we put all of this under the heading of moral literacy. Principals and superintendents enact moral literacy in their decision making when it comes to responding to the needs of students who have been impacted by the opioid crisis. The opioid crisis has been on the rise in the U.S. over the last several decades. According to 2016 Ohio drug overdose data, opioids were linked to over 86% of all drug-related deaths in the state of Ohio. One of the things that we targeted in this study was looking at this data in the ranges of 25 to 34-year-olds and 35 to 44-year-olds, because these were the ages of individuals who were most likely to have children in school. Also most likely to help us target areas where school-aged children were most likely impacted by the opioid crisis.
In terms of our research questions, we honed down to 3 in particular. The first being, how do rural educational leaders activate their moral agency to respond in a particular manner? How do these educational leaders engage in deliberation to consider potential outcomes and consequences of responding in certain ways to the students facing adverse experiences relating to the opioid crisis in their districts? And how do these educational leaders maintain the ethics sensitivity required to respond to the complex and sometimes conflicting values of stakeholders? The theoretical framework that we use has 4 facets in particular. The framework, it enhances the findings and how school leaders enact moral dispositions to respond to the needs of students. These 4 areas are moral care, moral responsibility, moral courage, and moral perseverance. And these dispositions are reflected in our findings, but characterized by GenLink here. So, for instance, moral care, is concerned for caring for individuals as unique persons. Moral perseverance is one abilities to maintain moral principles and conduct in light of the many external forces that affect educational leaders in this context. Moral responsibility is directly related to the ground decision-making process in relation to mutual responsibility. And moral selflessness is to act unselfishly, but not without a weighing of the repercussions of decisions being made in this situation.
When approaching this study, we operated with a narrative inquiry designed in mind, specifically because narrative inquiry revolves around the complexity of the human story and the lived experiences that we were attempting to tackle. And what that required us first to do was listen first to the practitioner's story and then let their experiences evolve from there. It's actually that complexity of their experiences is what, in fact, makes their narratives a potentially rich source of data. And in order to elicit those responses, we developed an interview schedule of questions which attempted to probe in an effort to gain insights into their realities. The participants we selected were all rural K-12 public school superintendents, principals, and educational leaders that have actually faced opioid-related dilemmas inside of the environments in which they work, specifically within the Appalachian Ohio counties that have the highest opioid-related death rates per 100,000 people. We gathered approximately 35 of these educational leaders who represent 30 school buildings, 20 districts, and 10 counties. The Appalachian region of Ohio is actually 32 counties. The oval represents the area in which we were working for the most part. And then with our findings, we arranged them around those 4 previously mentioned units: moral care, moral responsibility, moral selflessness, and moral perseverance. These are the units with which we analyzed our data.
The first of the themes that we're going to talk about today is moral care. And as a reminder, it's characterized by reciprocity, relatedness, and engrossment. and is concerned with caring for individuals as unique persons. And while many school leaders in our study discussed their engrossment in the lives of students inside and outside of school in relation to issues of poverty, resource dynamics in some of the schools we're in, consistently underfunded, under-resourced, and many of these were centered around the social concerns of the opioid crisis. Principals enacted moral care through providing access to many of the structural dilemmas that the things we just talked about create, such as food insecurity, clothing, basic necessities such as that, resources for students, parents, or maybe affected by or incapacitated by the opioid crisis through incarceration, grandparents raising kids, great-grandparents raising students. We have a couple of exemplar quotes here that we'd like to share. One of the assistant principals that we interviewed talked specifically about the work that him and his teachers had been doing in the school to address food insecurity, but particularly inside the dynamic of the opioid crisis. So he said, so we have teachers who go to the store every week to buy bread. We have peanut butter, and we have teachers right now making peanut butter sandwiches for kids. So when we were at that school doing our interviews with him and the principal, he gave us a tour of the building, and they actually had a peanut butter and jelly cart that kids could go to and make sandwiches during the school day, but also take food home for themselves. Another principal at another elementary school said the conditions that our kids are in and wondering sometimes when they get home, sometimes things get worse instead of better because of that report. And they're really concerned with kids' safety. Even at Christmas, you'd be amazed at how many kids on extended breaks cry when they have to leave, and they know that they're not going to have a lot of food at home. They're going to have someplace warm. One of the extended conversations across many of the interviews was the chaotic nature of the home environment that the opioid crisis has created, whether it's caregiver fluidity, your kids are with grandparents and they're with an aunt, or whether there's just chaos in the home through moving constantly or conditions of where they live. And this level of care or concern about this was a significant part of the discussion with our participants. The next thing we have that we would like to think about more is the idea of moral responsibility. And Jen Lake talks about this as an approach to decision making that's grounded in relationships and mutual responsibility. And it's also contextually bound. So the choices people might make in a suburban district around the opioid crisis will look very different contextually than the decisions that leaders make in a rural district, Appalachian, Ohio. In our discussions, sort of the defining this as a theme, school leaders often move through their daily tasks of being both an instructional leader and a sort of a building leader. They're constantly required to be attentive to contextually bound issues of the opioid crisis that drive their decision making. They have a difficult time, almost impossible time, separating the opioid crisis out of their daily work experience. One of the participants said, fortunately or unfortunately, this is a principal at elementary school, pretty small elementary school, whichever it is, probably more of our focus is on meeting families' basic needs than it is in instructional leadership with teachers. Food is a big issue. This came up over and over, but also buying things like school supplies. Many of the districts had set up clothing pantries and clothing banks for kids, constantly thinking about kids, the birthday / other gifty kind of ideas and for kids that they know are probably not going to have those kind of celebrations on a regular basis. A lot of the kids that the principals and teachers talk to us about, building leaders talk to us about, are also in foster care. So that adds another layer to this idea of more responsibility. Another participant who is a curriculum director, but also a pre-K principal, so she has a dual role, said, we feel a great urgency and a great moral obligation to these children because until we learn how to deal with trauma and we learn how to help them deal with that, it's a barrier to their learning. Most teachers just have not been trained in how to deal with this being the opioid crisis and its implications. And many of them, she said, feel very overwhelmed. I'll give you an example of this. There were a number of these the extreme cases, if you will. All of the leaders in all the districts talked about some of the extreme cases they had. And it ranged from things like kids getting off the bus and finding their caregiver murdered by their drug-addicted parent, or many overdoses happening in a football game in the evening where you have 6 or 7 overdoses at the same time because some bad drugs, quote unquote, went through the community. And the emergency squad are showing up at the football game because they've had a number of overdoses. Also, just a number of student caregiver deaths that impacted almost every district that we talked to, and school leaders were dealing with the implications of students in that kind of trauma. Moral selflessness is the idea to act in an unselfish manner when interacting with others. Jen Lake describes this, but to act in a manner that demonstrates concern for the overall well-being of all involved in the decision. When we talked about trying to make application of this idea to our findings, we thought about the best examples of how to sort of put this forward. So this is presented a little bit differently. It's more like a story. But this narrative represents what many of the principals and district superintendents talked about as we interacted with them. They were willing to and often put their well-being and care of others at the forefront of their leadership. They were at times put their physical safety in the margins too, and often their own well-being. Many of them were very stressed, and we had a lot of discussions and concern about their burnout potential as building leaders. Elementary principal said, and this is for her narrative, right? It's more of a story. Just less than 2 months ago, and she said, my phone rings, and it's like, this is kind of weird, she said to herself. It's an instant messenger call from a parent. So she gave all of the parents, most of all the parents had her phone number. She talked a lot about having distributed information in ways that anybody could contact her at any time. She said she answered the phone, and it was a third grade girl, and she said she was crying, and the third grader said, "Can you come and get me?" She talked to the third grader about this, and what was happening was the parents were fighting pretty violently, and this was a known opioid situation. So the principal said, she calls her assistant principal, and they seem to have a really good working relationship. We got a chance to talk to them together at one point, and they both agreed to go together to this kid's house. They knew that it could be violent. She talked extensively about when people are using drugs in this way, and there's already a violent episode going on, that they were walking into something where they didn't have a lot of understanding of what was going to happen. The police were also notified. So she said when they showed up, they found the police had gotten there. And she said the kid had a blanket and a backpack and everything. This kid was packed and ready to go. And the kid gets right to the principal's car, and the principal gets out and goes and talks to the mom and the police. And the mother asked if the girl could go home with the principal. And that's what happened. The principal took the child home with her, and the child spent the night with her for several days. We had many stories like this, many narratives like this, but all of them came from this sense of moral obligation and selflessness for the care of their students. Moral perseverance is to work through complexities despite the frustration of the task. It's one's ability to maintain moral principles and conduct in light of many external forces. So let's just think about this complexities and frustration of the task. The opioid crisis in the area where we have been studying has been going on for a couple of decades. So many of the districts that we interviewed have had an ongoing relationship, if you will, with this crisis. And some of the leaders have been in positions for 10 and 15 years and have been dealing with and managing the opioid crisis in their districts. When we asked the superintendents, what impact does this have on your district and how does it impact you in your leadership? He said in the bigger elementary school, they had 10 different cases during the school year in which 10 students lost one of their parents, 7 of them in the same grade. That created a level of fatigue among him and the teachers and the students. And he went in to just talk about his need to sort of persevere through that. The notion that generally moves forward of despite the complexities of the frustration of the task, this is one example. All of the districts we talked to had drug overdose deaths. All of the districts we talked to had students who had lost parents or caregivers, in addition to all of the other pieces that come with heavy opioid use and drug use in a community.
We're not just studying the opioid crisis. We're looking at how leaders, principals, superintendents, other district leaders are engaging with and responding to the needs of their districts and the impact that it's having on their students in those districts. It's about a leader's response to the opioid crisis. As these school leaders shared their stories, their lived experiences, their storied narratives, if you will, really speak to a deeper syndrome that school leadership is facing due to this crisis.
And so we're really wanting to bring this to the forefront of the discussion, saying schools need more support.
When it comes to combating this crisis, if you have any questions about this study, you can contact Dr. Hess at hessm@ohio.edu, or you can contact me at loweryc@ohio.edu, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.